The tavern girl's broken legs twisted at unnatural angles beneath her torn skirts as she lay crumpled on the cobblestones outside the Siren's Rest. Blood pooled around her shattered bones, mixing with the filthy water that ran through the gutters of Port Royal's most dangerous district. Her chest rose and fell in ragged gasps, each breath a monumental effort that sent waves of agony through her battered body. Above her, the three men who had done this to her stood laughing, their heavy boots still stained with her blood. "That's what happens when you serve pirates in our establishment," sneered Henry Peterson, the largest of the three enforcers sent by the Merchant Guild. His thick hands flexed as he wiped Nancy Hughes's blood from his knuckles. Should have thought twice before bringing that black-hearted devil his rum. Nancy's vision blurred as she tried to focus on the faces looming over her. The pain was beyond anything she had ever imagined, a white-hot fire that consumed every nerve in her legs. She had known this moment would come eventually. In a port town where pirates and merchants waged their endless war for control, serving the wrong customer could mean death. But she had never expected it to hurt this much, had never imagined the sound her bones would make when they snapped. The tavern door hung open behind them, revealing the chaos inside where tables had been overturned and chairs smashed against the walls. The other patrons had fled when Peterson and his men arrived, leaving only broken glass and spilled ale to witness her destruction. The Siren's Rest had been her sanctuary for 3 years, the only place in this godforsaken port where she could earn enough coin to survive. Now it would be her tomb. "Please," she whispered, the word barely audible through her swollen lips. "I was only doing my job." Michael Rogers, the second enforcer, spat into the gutter beside her head. "Your job was to refuse service to pirates, girl. The Merchant Guild made that clear to every tavern owner in Port Royal. But you had to go and serve Christopher Martinez, didn't you? Had to bring him his drink and smile while you did it." The mention of Christopher's name sent a different kind of pain through Nancy's chest. The pirate captain had been nothing but kind to her, always paying for his drinks and never causing trouble, like so many of the others who frequented the tavern. She had served him because he treated her with more respect than any merchant or naval officer ever had. But that kindness had cost her everything. Before we see how this ends, tell us where you were watching from and hype this video in the comments. Nancy tried to push herself up from the cobblestones, but her arms gave out beneath her. The world spun around her as she collapsed back down, her broken legs screaming in protest at even the slightest movement. She could taste blood in her mouth, could feel it running down her chin and staining the front of her simple brown dress. "Should we finish her off?" asked Peter Green, the youngest of the three men. His voice carried a tremor of uncertainty, as if some part of him recognized the horror of what they had done to an innocent girl. Peterson shook his head, his cold eyes never leaving Nancy's face. "No, let her live with what she's done. Let every other tavern wench in this port see what happens when they choose pirates over proper commerce. She'll never walk again, never work again. That's punishment enough." The three men turned to leave, their heavy footsteps echoing off the narrow walls of the alley. Nancy watched them go through a haze of tears and pain, her heart breaking as much as her body. She had no family to care for her, no friends wealthy enough to help with the kind of medical attention her injuries would require. In a place like Port Royal, a crippled tavern girl was as good as dead. As the sound of their footsteps faded into the distance, Nancy closed her eyes and tried to remember better times. She thought of her childhood in the countryside, before her parents died and left her with nothing but the clothes on her back and a desperate need to survive. She remembered the day she had first arrived in Port Royal, terrified and alone, clutching the few coins she had managed to save. The Siren's Rest had seemed like salvation then, a place where she could work and earn her keep without selling her body like so many other girls in the port. The irony was not lost on her that the very place that had saved her life was now the scene of its destruction. She had been happy there, as happy as anyone could be in such a rough establishment. The tavern keeper, William Hall, had been gruff but fair, paying her wages on time and never demanding more than honest work. The regular customers had grown to know her, some even leaving extra coins when they could afford it. And then there was Christopher Martinez. The pirate captain had first walked into the Siren's Rest 6 months ago, his long black coat still dripping with seawater, and his dark eyes scanning the room with the wariness of a man who had made too many enemies. Nancy had expected trouble, had braced herself for the kind of crude behavior that seemed to follow pirates wherever they went. Instead, she had found a man who spoke softly, paid his bills without argument, and always thanked her for her service. Christopher had never been like the other pirates who frequented the tavern. Where they were loud and boisterous, he was quiet and thoughtful. Where they grabbed at the serving girls and made lewd comments, he kept his hands to himself and treated Nancy with a courtesy that bordered on genteel. She had found herself looking forward to his visits, had even begun saving the best cuts of meat and the cleanest mugs for when he arrived. It had been a dangerous game, she realized now. In Port Royal, showing favor to a pirate was tantamount to treason against the merchant guild that controlled most of the town's commerce. The guild had made it clear that any establishment caught serving known pirates would face severe consequences. But Christopher had never seemed like the bloodthirsty villain the merchants claimed all pirates to be. Nancy remembered the night everything had changed between them. A group of drunk naval officers had cornered her in the tavern's back room, their hands rough and their intentions clear. She had been preparing to fight them off as best she could when Christopher appeared in the doorway like an avenging angel. He had not drawn his sword or raised his voice. He had simply looked at the officers with those dark, dangerous eyes of his and asked if there was a problem. The officers had released her immediately and stumbled back to their table, suddenly very interested in their drinks. Christopher had helped her straighten her dress and asked if she was hurt. When she shook her head, he had simply nodded and returned to his own table as if nothing had happened. But Nancy had seen the way his hand had rested on the pommel of his sword, had seen the cold fury in his eyes when he looked at the men who had been about to assault her. From that night forward, she had felt safe when Christopher was in the tavern. His presence seemed to cast a protective shadow over her, keeping the worst of the customers at bay. She had begun to look forward to their brief conversations, had found herself lingering at his table longer than was strictly necessary. He had a way of listening that made her feel like her words mattered, like she was more than just another tavern wench serving drinks to men who saw her as little more than furniture. The rain began to fall as Nancy lay broken in the alley, cold droplets mixing with the blood and tears on her face. Each drop felt like a tiny hammer blow against her battered body, but she welcomed the sensation. It meant she was still alive, still capable of feeling something other than the crushing pain in her legs. The cobblestones beneath her grew slick with water and blood, creating a crimson stream that flowed toward the harbor. She could hear the sounds of the port continuing around her, the distant shouts of sailors and the creak of ship masts swaying in the wind. Life went on as it always did in Port Royal, indifferent to the suffering of one broken girl in a forgotten alley. Nancy tried to call for help, but her voice came out as little more than a whisper. Even if someone heard her, what could they do? A doctor would cost more money than she had ever seen in her life, and the kind of healing her legs would require was beyond the skills of most physicians in the port. The reality of her situation began to sink in with the same crushing weight as the pain in her bones. She would never walk again, never work again, never be anything more than a burden to be pitied or ignored. In a place like Port Royal, such a fate was worse than death. At least the dead were buried with some dignity. The crippled were left to rot in the streets, forgotten by a world that had no use for them. As the rain continued to fall, Nancy found herself thinking about Christopher again. She wondered if he knew what had happened to her, if he cared that his presence in the tavern had led to her destruction. Part of her wanted to hate him for it, wanted to blame him for the choices that had brought her to this moment. But she could not summon the anger, could not find it in her heart to curse the man who had shown her more kindness than anyone else in this brutal world. She remembered the last time she had seen him, 3 days ago, when he had come to the tavern for what would be their final encounter. He had seemed different that night, more tense than usual, his eyes constantly scanning the room as if he expected trouble. Nancy had asked if everything was all right, and he had given her one of his rare smiles. "Just the usual concerns of a man in my profession," he had said, his voice carrying that slight accent she had never been able to place. "Nothing for you to worry about, Nancy." It had been the first time he had used her name, and the sound of it on his lips had sent a warm flutter through her chest. She had wanted to say something in response, had wanted to tell him how much his kindness had meant to her over the months, but the words had stuck in her throat, held back by the same fear that governed every interaction between pirates and civilians in Port Royal. Now lying broken in the rain, Nancy wished she had found the courage to speak. She wished she had told Christopher how his presence had made the tavern feel less like a prison and more like a home. She wished she had thanked him for treating her like a human being instead of just another serving girl to be ignored or abused. Most of all, she wished she had warned him about the Merchant Guild's growing hostility toward anyone who showed pirates hospitality. The sound of approaching footsteps made Nancy's heart race with terror. She tried to turn her head to see who was coming, but the movement sent fresh waves of agony through her broken body. The footsteps were different from those of Peterson and his men, lighter and more measured. They paused at the mouth of the alley, and Nancy heard a sharp intake of breath. "Dear God in heaven," a familiar voice whispered, and Nancy's eyes widened as she recognized the accent. Christopher Martinez stepped into view, his dark coat billowing behind him as he rushed to her side. His face was a mask of horror and rage as he took in the extent of her injuries. "Nancy," he said, his voice breaking as he knelt beside her in the filthy water. "What have they done to you?" She tried to speak, tried to warn him that staying here was dangerous, but only a weak moan escaped her lips. Christopher's hands hovered over her broken form, clearly wanting to help but afraid of causing more damage. His eyes were wild with an emotion Nancy had never seen in them before, for a raw fury that made her think of storms at sea. "Who did this?" he demanded, his voice low and deadly. "Tell me who did this to you." "Peterson," Nancy managed to whisper, the name falling from her lips like a curse. "Henry Peterson, from the Merchant Guild. They said I should not have served you." Christopher's face went completely still, and Nancy saw something terrible flicker in his dark eyes. For a moment she glimpsed the pirate captain that the merchants and naval officers feared, the man who had earned his reputation through blood and steel. Then his expression softened as he looked down at her again, and she saw only the gentle soul who had protected her in the tavern. "I am going to get you help," he said, his voice steady despite the rage Nancy could see burning beneath the surface. "I'm going to make this right." "No," Nancy gasped, summoning every ounce of strength she had left. "Too dangerous. They will kill you if they find you here." Christopher's jaw tightened, but he did not argue. Instead, he carefully slipped his arms beneath her broken body, lifting her with a gentleness that seemed impossible for a man of his size and reputation. Nancy cried out as the movement jarred her shattered bones, but she bit down on her lip to keep from screaming. She could feel Christopher's heart pounding against her cheek as he held her close to his chest. "Where are we going?" she whispered as he carried her out of the alley. "To my ship," Christopher replied, his voice grim with determination. "I have a surgeon aboard who can help you. And then I am going to have a conversation with Mr. Peterson about the proper treatment of innocent young women." Nancy wanted to protest, wanted to tell him that helping her would only make him more enemies in a port where he already had too many. But the warmth of his arms around her and the steady rhythm of his breathing were already lulling her toward unconsciousness. For the first time since Peterson and his men had shattered her legs, she felt safe. The journey to Christopher's ship passed in a haze of pain and exhaustion. Nancy drifted in and out of consciousness, vaguely aware of the sounds and smells of the harbor around them. She could hear Christopher speaking in low, urgent tones to someone, could feel herself being transferred to other arms that were just as careful with her broken body. When she next opened her eyes, she was lying on a narrow bunk in what appeared to be a ship's cabin. The walls were lined with books and maps, and a single lantern cast a warm glow over the small space. The pain in her legs was still there, but it had been dulled by something that made her thoughts feel thick and slow. "You are awake," said a voice from beside the bunk, and Nancy turned her head to see an older man with kind eyes and gentle hands. "I am Dr. Marie James, the ship's surgeon. Captain Martinez brought you to me in quite a state." Nancy tried to sit up, but Marie placed a firm hand on her shoulder. "No, child, you must rest. Your legs were badly broken, but I have done what I can to set the bones properly. Whether you will walk again remains to be seen, but there is hope." "Christopher," Nancy whispered, her throat dry and scratchy. Where is he? Marie's expression grew troubled. The captain has gone ashore to attend to some business. He was quite upset about what happened to you, I am afraid. I have never seen him in such a state. Nancy's heart clenched with fear. She knew Christopher well enough to understand what kind of business he had gone to attend to. Peterson and his men had made a powerful enemy when they chose to break her legs, and she was terrified of what the pirate captain might do in his rage. You must stop him, she said, trying once again to sit up despite Marie's restraining hand. Peterson has friends in the Merchant Guild and the naval garrison. If Christopher confronts him, they will kill him. Marie's face softened with understanding. The captain is not a fool, child. He knows the dangers of this port better than most. But he is also a man of honor, and what was done to you was an affront to everything he believes in. Nancy closed her eyes, feeling tears leak from beneath her lids. She had brought nothing but trouble to the man who had shown her kindness, had made him a target simply by accepting his patronage at the tavern. The guilt was almost worse than the physical pain, a crushing weight that settled over her chest like a stone. Hours passed before Christopher returned to the ship, and Nancy could tell from the sound of his footsteps on the deck above that something had changed. When he finally appeared in the doorway of the cabin, his coat was torn, and there was blood on his knuckles. But his dark eyes were calm, almost serene, in a way that made Nancy's breath catch in her throat. How are you feeling? He asked, settling into a chair beside her bunk with the careful movements of a man who had been in a fight. What did you do? Nancy whispered, though part of her was afraid to hear the answer. Christopher was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on something beyond the cabin's small window. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft but carried an edge of steel that made Nancy shiver. I had a conversation with Mr. Peterson and his associates, he said simply. They will not be troubling you or any other tavern girl again. Nancy's heart pounded as she tried to read the expression on his face. Christopher, what did you do? He turned to look at her then, and Nancy saw something in his eyes that had not been there before. It was not cruelty or bloodlust, but rather a kind of quiet satisfaction, like a man who had finally set right a great wrong. Peterson and his men are alive, Christopher said, seeming to understand her fear, but they have been reminded of the consequences of harming innocent people. The Merchant Guild will think twice before sending their enforcers to break the bones of young women. Nancy felt a mixture of relief and terror wash over her. She was grateful that Christopher had not committed murder on her behalf, but she knew that his actions would have consequences. The Merchant Guild would not forget this insult, and they would find ways to make both Christopher and anyone associated with him pay for it. You should not have done this for me, she said, her voice breaking with emotion. I am nobody, just a tavern girl. You have made yourself enemies for someone who is not worth the trouble. Christopher's expression grew fierce, and he leaned forward in his chair. Do not ever say that again, he said, his voice low and intense. You are not nobody, Nancy Hughes. You are a woman of courage and kindness who deserves to be treated with respect and dignity. What Peterson did to you was an abomination, and I will not stand by and let such cruelty go unanswered. The passion in his voice took Nancy's breath away. She had never heard anyone speak about her with such conviction, had never imagined that someone like Christopher Martinez could see value in a girl like her. Tears spilled down her cheeks as she looked up at him, this dangerous man who had risked everything to defend her honor. Why, she whispered. Why would you do this for me? Christopher was quiet for a long moment, his dark eyes searching her face. When he spoke, his voice was gentler than she had ever heard it. Because in all the months I spent in that tavern, you were the only person who treated me like a human being instead of a monster, he said. You served me with kindness and never showed fear, even when others warned you away from me. You made me remember what it was like to be treated with simple human decency. Nancy felt her heart breaking and healing at the same time. She had thought her kindness toward Christopher had been insignificant, just the basic courtesy any decent person would show. She had never realized how much it meant to him, how rare such treatment was in his dangerous world. I never knew, she said, reaching out with a trembling hand to touch his arm. I just thought you seemed lonely. Christopher's smile was shown in beautiful. I was lonely, Nancy, more lonely than I had realized until I met you. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, Nancy's hand resting on Christopher's arm as the ship swayed gently at anchor. The pain in her legs was still there, but it seemed less important now, overshadowed by the warmth spreading through her chest. For the first time since Peterson and his men had shattered her bones, Nancy felt like she might have a future worth living. What happens now? She asked eventually. I cannot go back to the tavern, even if my legs heal properly. Peterson made it clear that serving you was my crime. Christopher's jaw tightened, but his voice remained calm. You will stay here on my ship until you are fully recovered. Dr. James believes you will walk again, though it may take many months of healing. After that, the choice is yours. Nancy frowned, not understanding. What choice? You can return to shore if you wish, Christopher said carefully. I have contacts in other ports, places where the Merchant Guild has no power. I could arrange for you to find work somewhere safe, somewhere you could start over. And the other option? Nancy asked, though she thought she already knew the answer. Christopher's dark eyes met hers, and Nancy saw hope and vulnerability warring in their depths. You could stay with me, join my crew, see the world beyond Port Royal. It would not be an easy life, but you would be free, and you would be safe. Nancy's heart raced at the thought. Life aboard a pirate ship would be dangerous and uncertain, but it would also be an adventure unlike anything she had ever imagined. More importantly, it would mean staying with Christopher, this complex man who had shown her more kindness and respect than anyone else in her life. I would like that, she said softly, Bivante, and watched as Christopher's face lit up with joy. The next several weeks passed in a blur of healing and discovery. Nancy's legs mended slowly under Dr. James's careful attention, and she gradually regained the ability to move around the ship with the aid of crutches. The crew of the Serpent's Revenge, as Christopher's ship was called, treated her with a respect and courtesy that surprised her. She had expected pirates to be crude and violent, but these men seemed to genuinely care for their captain, and by extension, for anyone he chose to protect. Nancy learned that Christopher's reputation as a bloodthirsty pirate was largely exaggerated. While he was certainly capable of violence when necessary, he preferred to avoid unnecessary bloodshed and treated his crew more like family than subordinates. The Serpent's Revenge was not a typical pirate vessel, but rather a ship of outcasts and misfits who had found purpose and belonging under Christopher's leadership. As Nancy grew stronger, she began to take on small duties around the ship. She helped the cook prepare meals, mended sails and clothing, and even learned basic navigation from Christopher himself. She discovered that she had a natural aptitude for the work and found herself genuinely enjoying the challenges of life at sea. More importantly, she and Christopher grew closer with each passing day. Their conversations ranged from practical matters of seamanship to deeper discussions about their pasts and dreams for the future. Nancy learned that Christopher had not chosen piracy, but had been forced into it by circumstances beyond his control. He had once been a merchant sailor himself, but a corrupt naval officer had falsely accused him of smuggling and sentenced him to hang. He had escaped and turned to piracy out of necessity, but his true goal was to earn enough money to purchase a legitimate merchant vessel and return to honest trade. Nancy found herself falling in love with this complex, honorable man who had saved her from a life of misery and shown her a world of possibilities she had never imagined. She could see in his eyes that he cared for her as well, but both of them were careful not to speak of their feelings directly. The memory of her broken legs and the circumstances that had brought them together cast a shadow over their growing affection. One evening, as they stood together on the ship's deck, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant shades of orange and gold, Christopher finally broached the subject that had been weighing on both their minds. Nancy, he said quietly, I need you to know that I do not expect anything from you. When I brought you aboard this ship, it was to save your life, not to make you feel obligated to me in any way. Nancy turned to look at him, seeing the uncertainty in his dark eyes. What do you mean? I mean that if you choose to stay with me, with us, it must be because you truly want to, not because you feel you owe me a debt, Christopher said. You are free to leave whenever you wish, and I will make sure you have everything you need to start a new life wherever you choose. Nancy felt her heart swell with love for this man who was so careful of her feelings, so determined to give her choices even when it might cost him his own happiness. She reached out and took his hand, feeling the calluses on his palm from years of working with ropes and rigging. "Christopher," she said softly, "you saved my life, but not just from Peterson and his men. You saved me from a life of servitude and fear, showed me that I could be more than just a tavern girl waiting for the next customer to abuse me. I do not stay with you out of obligation. I stay because I choose to, because I have found something here that I never had on shore." "And what is that?" Christopher asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "A home," Nancy replied, standing on her tiptoes to kiss him gently. "A family, and a man who sees me as more than just a broken girl with shattered legs." Christopher's arms came around her then, holding her close as the sun disappeared beneath the horizon. Nancy could feel the strength in his embrace, the same strength that had carried her from that bloody alley to safety. But she could also feel his gentleness, the care he took not to hurt her still healing body. "I love you, Nancy Hughes," he whispered against her hair. "Not because you served me drinks in a tavern, not because you were kind to a pirate when others were not. I love you because you are brave and strong and beautiful, because you chose to rebuild your life instead of giving up when it would have been easier to surrender." Nancy felt tears streaming down her face, but they were tears of joy rather than sorrow. "I love you too, Christopher Martinez. I love the man you are, not the reputation others have given you. I love your honor and your kindness, and the way you make me feel like I can be anything I choose to be." They held each other as the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, two souls who had found in each other the home they had both been searching for. Nancy knew that their life together would not be easy, that there would be dangers and challenges ahead. But she also knew that whatever came, they would face it together. 3 months after Nancy's rescue, the Serpent's Revenge sailed into the harbor of a small island settlement called Haven's Rest. Unlike the hostile ports controlled by merchant guilds or naval authorities, Haven's Rest was a free settlement where pirates, merchants, and other sailors could trade and resupply without fear of persecution. Christopher had brought Nancy here to meet with a contact who might be able to help them secure legitimate papers and begin the process of transitioning away from piracy. Nancy had grown strong enough to walk without crutches, though she still favored her left leg slightly. The physical scars of her encounter with Peterson would never fully fade, but she had learned to see them not as marks of shame, but as proof of her survival and strength. Dr. James had pronounced her healing remarkable, and Nancy credited her recovery to the loving care she had received aboard the Serpent's Revenge. As they walked through the bustling market of Haven's Rest, Nancy marveled at the diversity of people and goods on display. Former pirates sold exotic spices alongside reformed smugglers hawking fine silks. Ex-naval officers who had grown tired of corrupt superiors worked as mercenaries and shipguards. It was a place where people could reinvent themselves, where past sins could be forgiven in favor of present contributions. "There," Christopher said, pointing toward a small tavern at the end of the market street. "That is where we are supposed to meet William Hall." Nancy's eyes widened in surprise. "William Hall? The tavern keeper? From the Siren's Rest? What is he doing here?" Christopher's expression grew grim. "After what happened to you, Peterson and the Merchant Guild decided to make an example of anyone who had shown hospitality to pirates. They seized the Siren's Rest and had William arrested on charges of harboring criminals. He escaped during transport and made his way here." Nancy felt a stab of guilt pierce her heart. Another person had suffered because of her association with Christopher. She wondered how many others had paid the price for Peterson's determination to make her an example. They found William Hall sitting alone at a corner table, looking older and more careworn than Nancy remembered. His face lit up when he saw her, and he rose to embrace her like a father greeting a long-lost daughter. "Nancy, my dear girl," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "When I heard what those bastards did to you, I feared the worst. I am so glad to see you alive and well." "I am sorry about the tavern," Nancy said, feeling tears prick her eyes. "I never meant for you to lose everything because of me." William waved away her apology. "The Siren's Rest was just a building, child. You are worth more than any tavern. Besides, I have been thinking it might be time for a change anyway. They sat down together and William explained his situation. The Merchant Guild had not only seized his tavern, but had also put a bounty on his head for aiding and abetting pirates. He could never return to Port Royal or any other settlement under Guild control. But he had heard about Haven's Rest and thought he might start over here, perhaps open a new establishment that catered to the island's diverse population. That is actually why I wanted to meet with you, Christopher said. I have been thinking about leaving piracy behind, finding a way to make an honest living. Nancy has shown me that there are things worth more than gold and adventure. William raised an eyebrow. What did you have in mind? A partnership, Christopher replied. I have saved enough money over the years to purchase a legitimate merchant vessel. You have the experience to run a trading business. Together, we could establish a shipping company that serves settlements like Haven's Rest, places that are often ignored by the major trading houses. Nancy felt her heart soar at the suggestion. The idea of Christopher leaving his dangerous life behind, of them building something together that was both profitable and honorable, was more than she had dared to hope for. William considered the proposal carefully. It would not be easy, he said finally. We would be competing against established companies with better ships and more resources. And there would always be the risk that our past associations would catch up with us. True, Christopher acknowledged, but we would also have advantages they lack. We know these waters and these people better than any merchant house based in London or Madrid. We understand what the smaller settlements need and how to get it to them efficiently. Nancy found herself speaking up, surprising herself with her boldness. And we would treat our customers and employees fairly, like human beings rather than sources of profit. That has to count for something. Both men looked at her with approval, and Nancy felt a warm glow of pride. She was no longer just the broken tavern girl who had been rescued from an alley. She was becoming a partner in planning their future, a woman whose opinions were valued and respected. The girl has a point, William said with a smile. In my experience, treating people decently is often the best business strategy of all. It builds loyalty and trust, which are worth more than gold in the long run. They spent the rest of the afternoon discussing details and possibilities. Christopher would sell the Serpent's Revenge and use the proceeds to purchase a smaller but more respectable merchant vessel. William would use his contacts in the tavern trade to identify potential customers and suppliers. Nancy, meanwhile, would handle the company's books and correspondence, skills she had been developing during her recovery aboard the pirate ship. As the sun began to set, they shook hands on their agreement. It would take time to arrange everything, to secure the necessary papers and permits, to find the right ship and crew. But for the first time in years, all three of them had something to look forward to beyond mere survival. 6 months later, Nancy stood on the deck of the Honest Endeavor, watching as Christopher supervised the loading of their latest cargo. The ship was smaller than the Serpent's Revenge, but faster and more efficient, perfect for the coastal trading routes they had established between Haven's Rest and a dozen other free settlements. Their business was thriving beyond their most optimistic projections, and Nancy could hardly believe how much her life had changed. She wore a simple blue dress that Christopher had bought for her in Nassau, along with a wide-brimmed hat that protected her face from the Caribbean sun. Her legs had healed completely, with only a slight limp remaining to remind her of that terrible night in Port Royal. More importantly, the fear and servility that had once defined her had been replaced by confidence and purpose. The Honest Endeavor carried legitimate cargo now, spices and textiles and manufactured goods that the smaller settlements desperately needed. They charged fair prices and paid their crew well, earning a reputation for reliability and integrity that was slowly but surely building their customer base. Nancy handled the company's finances with a skill that surprised even herself, discovering a natural aptitude for numbers and negotiation. William Hall had established a new tavern in Haven's Rest called the Second Chance, which served as both their unofficial headquarters and a gathering place for the island's diverse community. Unlike the Siren's Rest, which had been a rough establishment catering to the desperate and dangerous, the Second Chance was a respectable business that welcomed everyone from reformed pirates to honest merchants. Nancy often worked in the tavern when the Honest Endeavor was in port, But her role was very different from her days as a serving girl. She was now a partner in the business, with a say in every major decision and a share of the profits. More importantly, she was treated with respect by customers and employees alike, her opinions valued and her contributions recognized. The transformation had not been without its challenges. There had been attempts by competitors to undercut their prices, and more than one suspicious customs official had questioned their legitimacy. But Christopher's reputation, while complicated, also provided them with a certain protection. Few people were willing to cheat or threaten a company owned by a former pirate captain, especially one known for his sense of honor and swift justice. "Nancy," Christopher called from the dock, "could you bring me the manifest for the Nassau cargo?" She smiled and retrieved the requested document from the ship's small office, a cabin that had once served as Christopher's private quarters. As she handed him the papers, their fingers brushed, and she felt the same warm flutter in her chest that his touch always provoked. They had been married for 2 months now, a simple ceremony performed by the island's magistrate, with William serving as witness. It had been the happiest day of Nancy's life. "How long until we can depart?" she asked, checking the position of the sun. "Another hour, perhaps 2, Christopher replied. "The crew is being careful with the glassware. We cannot afford to have it arrive in Nassau as expensive fragments." Nancy nodded, understanding the importance of their reputation for delivering goods undamaged. Word traveled fast in the Caribbean, and a single incident of careless handling could cost them customers they had worked hard to win. As she watched Christopher work, Nancy marveled at how naturally he had adapted to legitimate business. His skills as a leader translated perfectly to managing a merchant crew, and his knowledge of Caribbean waters was invaluable in planning efficient routes. He seemed happier now than she had ever seen him, the constant tension of piracy replaced by the satisfaction of honest work. "Mrs. Martinez," called a voice from the dock, and Nancy turned to see a young woman approaching with a baby in her arms. It was Kimberly Chavez, one of the island's newest residents and a customer of both their shipping business and William's Tavern. "Please, call me Nancy," she replied with a smile. "How can I help you?" "I wanted to thank you for arranging the shipment of medicine from Port-au-Prince," Kimberly said, her eyes bright with gratitude. "My little one was so sick, and the local doctor said there was nothing he could do. But the medicine you brought saved her life." Nancy felt tears prick her eyes as she looked at the healthy baby gurgling contentedly in her mother's arms. This was why their work mattered, why the long hours and difficult negotiations were worthwhile. They were not just moving cargo from one port to another. They were connecting communities and providing lifelines to people who had nowhere else to turn. "I am just glad we could help," Nancy said, reaching out to gently touch the baby's cheek. "That is what we are here for." After Kimberly left, Nancy stood quietly on the deck, reflecting on the journey that had brought her to this moment. Less than a year ago, she had been a broken girl lying in a filthy alley, convinced that her life was over. Now she was a successful businesswoman, a beloved wife, and a valued member of a community that respected and appreciated her contributions. The scars on her legs would always remind her of that terrible night, but they no longer filled her with shame or bitterness. Instead, they served as proof of her resilience, evidence that she could survive anything and emerge stronger on the other side. Peterson and his men had tried to break her spirit along with her bones, but they had failed completely. As the Honest Endeavor prepared to depart Haven's Rest for their next trading run, Nancy found herself thinking about the letter that had arrived that morning. It was from an unexpected source, a merchant in Port Royal who claimed to represent a group of business owners interested in establishing trade relationships with their company. "Are you certain this is not some kind of trap?" Nancy asked Christopher as they stood together in their cabin, reviewing the correspondence. "After what happened with Peterson, I find it hard to believe that anyone in Port Royal would want to do business with us." Christopher frowned as he reread the letter. "The signature is legitimate, and I recognize the name. Michael Rogers was one of Peterson's associates, but he was also known to be more reasonable than his colleagues. It is possible that the Merchant Guild has undergone some changes since we left." Nancy felt a chill run down her spine at the mention of Rogers' name. She remembered him as one of the 3 men who had stood over her broken body, laughing at her pain. The idea of doing business with him, of treating him as a respectable customer, made her stomach turn. I cannot do it, she said quietly. I cannot pretend to be civil to one of the men who destroyed my legs and laughed about it. Christopher set the letter aside and took her hands in his. You do not have to do anything you are not comfortable with. We have built a successful business without Port Royal's trade, and we can continue to do so. But it would be profitable, Nancy said, hating herself for even considering it. The Port Royal market is huge, and if we could establish ourselves there, it would open up opportunities throughout the Caribbean. Money is not worth your peace of mind, Christopher replied firmly. We have enough to live comfortably and grow our business at a reasonable pace. We do not need to compromise our principles for profit. Nancy loved him even more for saying that, but she also knew that he was thinking like a husband rather than a businessman. The opportunity to expand into Port Royal was significant, and refusing it entirely might be short-sighted. There had to be a middle ground, a way to explore the possibility without putting herself through unnecessary trauma. What if we sent William to meet with them first, she suggested. He could assess their sincerity and report back to us. If it seems legitimate, we could consider a limited trial arrangement. Christopher considered this carefully. That might work. William knows Port Royal as well as anyone, and he has a good sense for when people are being deceptive. But are you certain you want to risk any kind of involvement with that place? Nancy was quiet for a long moment, wrestling with her own emotions. Part of her wanted nothing to do with Port Royal or anyone associated with it. But another part of her, the part that had grown strong and confident over the past months, was curious about what had changed there. She had fled Port Royal as a broken victim, but she would return as a successful businesswoman with a loving husband and a thriving company. There was a certain poetic justice in that transformation. Yes, she said finally, I think I want to know what they have to say, but carefully and with plenty of precautions. Christopher nodded, though Nancy could see the concern in his dark eyes. Very well. We will ask William to make some discreet inquiries when we return to Haven's Rest, but at the first sign of trouble, we withdraw completely. Agreed? Agreed, Nancy said, sealing the promise with a kiss. 2 weeks later, William returned from his reconnaissance mission to Port Royal with news that surprised them all. The Merchant Guild had indeed undergone significant changes, largely as a result of Christopher's confrontation with Peterson and his associates. The three enforcers had been found beaten and humiliated in the same alley where they had broken Nancy's legs, tied up and left with signs around their necks declaring them cowards and bullies. The incident had caused a scandal within the guild, particularly when it became known that they had attacked an innocent tavern girl rather than confronting Christopher directly. Several of the more moderate members had used the opportunity to challenge the guild's increasingly brutal tactics, arguing that such behavior was bad for business and contrary to civilized values. Peterson himself had been expelled from the guild and had left Port Royal in disgrace. His associates, including Rogers, had managed to retain their positions, but had been forced to publicly apologize for their actions and promise to reform their methods. The new leadership was apparently eager to distance themselves from the old regime's excesses and was actively seeking to improve relationships with previously marginalized groups. They specifically asked about you, Nancy, William reported as they sat in the Second Chance's private dining room. Rogers seemed genuinely remorseful about what happened, and he claimed that the guild wants to make amends. Nancy felt a mixture of skepticism and curiosity. The idea that her attackers might actually feel guilty about what they had done was almost too much to believe. But if it was true, it represented a significant shift in Port Royal's power structure. What kind of amends? She asked. They are offering preferential trading terms for our first year of operations in Port Royal, William explained. Reduced docking fees, expedited customs processing, and introductions to their best customers. They also want to make a formal apology to you personally. Christopher's jaw tightened. That sounds like an attempt to buy forgiveness rather than genuine remorse. Perhaps, William agreed, but it also represents a real opportunity. If we can establish ourselves in Port Royal under favorable terms, it would give us access to markets throughout the Caribbean. The profits could fund expansion into the Pacific trade routes. Nancy found herself torn between practical considerations and emotional reservations. The business opportunity was undeniably attractive, But the thought of returning to the place where she had suffered so much filled her with dread. She had worked hard to overcome the trauma of that night, but she was not certain she was ready to face her attackers directly. After much deliberation, Nancy and Christopher decided to accept the Merchant Guild's invitation, but with strict conditions. They would meet with Rogers and the guild leadership in a neutral location, the governor's mansion, with William and several trusted associates present as witnesses. Nancy would have the right to end the meeting at any time if she felt uncomfortable, and Christopher would be armed and prepared to defend her if necessary. The meeting was scheduled for a week later, giving Nancy time to prepare herself mentally and emotionally. She spent hours discussing her feelings with Christopher and Dr. James, who had remained with them as both ship's surgeon and trusted advisor. Both men assured her that she was under no obligation to forgive her attackers or to accept their apology if it seemed insincere. Remember, Christopher told her the night before they were to depart for Port Royal, "You are not the same person who was broken in that alley. You are Nancy Martinez, successful businesswoman and beloved wife. You have nothing to prove to anyone, and you owe them nothing." Nancy nodded, drawing strength from his words and his presence. She had chosen to face this challenge not out of obligation or desperation, but because she wanted to see how far she had come. The scared tavern girl who had once served drinks in the Siren's Rest was gone, replaced by a woman of substance and dignity who commanded respect wherever she went. The journey to Port Royal was uneventful, and Nancy found herself surprisingly calm as they approached the familiar harbor. The port looked much the same as when she had left it, but she saw it now with different eyes. Instead of a place of fear and oppression, she saw opportunity and potential. The bustling docks and crowded markets represented customers and profits rather than threats and dangers. The governor's mansion was an imposing colonial structure that overlooked the harbor from a hill above the town. Nancy had never been inside it during her years as a tavern girl, but now she walked through its ornate doors as an honored guest. The transformation felt almost surreal, like something from a fairy tale. Rogers was waiting for them in the governor's private study, along with two other guild representatives Nancy did not recognize. He looked older than she remembered, with new lines around his eyes and a nervous manner that suggested genuine anxiety about the meeting. When he saw Nancy enter the room, he immediately stood and bowed deeply. "Mrs. Martinez," he said, his voice formal but respectful. "Thank you for agreeing to meet with us. I know this cannot be easy for you." Nancy studied his face carefully, looking for signs of deception or mockery. Instead, she saw what appeared to be genuine remorse and embarrassment. This was not the arrogant enforcer who had stood over her broken body, but a man who seemed genuinely troubled by his past actions. "Mr. Rogers," she replied coolly, taking a seat across from him at the governor's polished mahogany table, "I am here to listen to what you have to say." Rogers swallowed nervously and glanced at his companions before speaking. "First, I want to offer you a formal apology for what happened that night. What Peterson did to you, what we all did, was inexcusable. You were an innocent young woman trying to earn an honest living, and we treated you like a criminal. I have regretted it every day since." Nancy felt a flicker of surprise at the apparent sincerity in his voice. She had expected excuses or justifications, not a straightforward admission of guilt. "Why, Pa?" she asked. "Why did you do it if you knew it was wrong?" Rogers looked down at his hands, clearly struggling with the question. "Fear, mostly. Fear of pirates, fear of losing control, fear of appearing weak to our customers and competitors. Peterson convinced us that making an example of you would send a message that the guild was strong and decisive. We were wrong, and you paid the price for our cowardice." Christopher leaned forward in his chair, his dark eyes fixed on Rogers with laser intensity. "And what has changed since then? Why should we believe that the guild has truly reformed its methods?" One of the other representatives, a middle-aged woman Nancy did not recognize, spoke up. "Because the old methods were not only morally wrong, they were also bad for business. The brutality and intimidation tactics were driving away customers and creating unnecessary conflicts. We have learned that cooperation and mutual respect are far more profitable than fear and violence." Nancy found herself cautiously impressed by the woman's directness. She had expected the usual merchant double talk about market conditions and competitive pressures. not an honest admission that their previous tactics had been counterproductive. "What exactly are you proposing?" Nancy asked. Rogers pulled out a formal document and slid it across the table. "A full trading partnership with preferential terms for the first 2 years. We will provide you with warehouse space, customs assistance, and introductions to our most reliable customers. In return, we ask only that you give us the opportunity to prove that the guild has changed." Nancy read through the contract carefully, her business training allowing her to spot potential problems and hidden clauses. To her surprise, the terms were genuinely favorable, with no obvious traps or disadvantageous provisions. It was exactly the kind of deal she would have hoped for if she were approaching Port Royal as a new market. "This is very generous," she said finally. "Perhaps too generous. What is the real reason you are offering us such favorable terms?" The woman smiled slightly. "Because we need you more than you need us. Your reputation for fair dealing and reliable service has spread throughout the Caribbean. Having the honest endeavor operating out of Port Royal would enhance our credibility and attract other reputable merchants to work with us." Nancy felt a surge of pride at the compliment. The idea that her company's reputation was valuable enough to justify such favorable terms was deeply satisfying. She had built something worthwhile, something that commanded respect in the very place where she had once been treated as worthless. The negotiations continued for several hours, with Christopher and William carefully reviewing every aspect of the proposed partnership. Nancy found herself taking the lead in many of the discussions, her confidence growing as she realized how much she had learned about business and commerce over the past year. The men across the table treated her as an equal partner, seeking her opinion on everything from shipping schedules to payment terms. As the meeting progressed, Nancy began to see a different side of Port Royal's merchant community. These were not the brutal enforcers who had broken her legs, but pragmatic business people who had learned from their mistakes and were genuinely interested in building profitable relationships. The transformation seemed real, driven by practical considerations rather than moral awakening, but no less significant for that. "There is one more thing," Rogers said as they prepared to finalize the agreement. "The Guild would like to make a formal gesture of apology, something public that acknowledges our past mistakes and demonstrates our commitment to change." Nancy raised an eyebrow. "What kind of gesture?" "A donation to establish a fund for tavern workers and other service employees who are injured or mistreated by customers," the woman explained. "It would be administered by an independent board and provide medical care, legal assistance, and temporary support for people in situations similar to what you experienced." Nancy felt tears prick her eyes at the suggestion. The idea that her suffering might be transformed into something that could help others in similar situations was deeply moving. It would not undo what had happened to her, but it might prevent others from enduring the same trauma. "How much?" she asked quietly. £5,000 to start, with annual contributions of £1,000 thereafter," Rogers replied. "We would also like to name it the Nancy Martinez Fund for Worker Protection, if you would agree to that." Nancy looked at Christopher, seeing her own emotions reflected in his dark eyes. This was more than they had dared to hope for, a genuine attempt to make amends that went far beyond mere business considerations. "I would be honored," Nancy said, her voice thick with emotion. "But I have one condition. The fund should also provide assistance to people who want to leave abusive situations and start new lives elsewhere. Sometimes the best solution is escape, not confrontation." "Agreed," the woman said immediately. "That is an excellent addition to the program." They spent another hour working out the details of both the business partnership and the charitable fund. Nancy found herself genuinely impressed by the Guild's new leadership and their apparent commitment to reform. It was not the dramatic transformation she might have hoped for, but it was real progress, driven by practical experience rather than idealistic rhetoric. As they prepared to leave the governor's mansion, Rogers approached Nancy privately. "Mrs. Martinez, I know that nothing I can say will undo what we did to you, but I want you to know that seeing what you have accomplished, seeing the woman you have become despite everything we put you through, has taught me more about strength and dignity than anything else in my life." Nancy studied his face one more time, looking for any sign of deception or manipulation. Instead, she saw only genuine respect and admiration, along with what appeared to be lasting shame for his past actions. "Thank you," she said simply. "I hope you have learned something valuable from this experience." "I have," Rogers replied. "I have learned that treating people with cruelty and disrespect ultimately diminishes everyone involved. I have learned that real strength comes from lifting others up, not tearing them down. And I have learned that sometimes the people we think are powerless can teach us the most important lessons of all." Nancy felt a weight lift from her shoulders as she walked away from the meeting. She had faced her attackers and found them transformed into something approaching decent human beings. More importantly, she had discovered that she no longer needed their apology or approval to feel whole. She had built a new life based on her own choices and efforts, and nothing they could say or do would diminish that achievement. Christopher took her hand as they walked back toward the harbor, his fingers intertwining with hers in the familiar gesture that never failed to make her feel safe and loved. "How do you feel?" he asked softly. Nancy considered the question carefully. "Free," she said finally. "For the first time since that night in the alley, I feel completely free. The fear is gone, the anger is gone, even the need for revenge is gone. I am just Nancy Martinez, successful businesswoman, and that is enough." Christopher squeezed her hand gently. "It is more than enough. It is everything." As they reached the harbor where the Honest Endeavor waited at anchor, Nancy turned back to look at the town that had once been her prison. Port Royal spread out before her in the afternoon sunlight, bustling with commerce and opportunity. She could see the narrow alley where her old life had ended and her new one had begun, but it no longer held any power over her emotions. She had returned to Port Royal as a victim seeking justice, but she was leaving as a victor who had transcended the need for revenge. The broken tavern girl was truly gone, replaced by a woman who had found her strength not in bitterness or hatred, but in love, purpose, and the simple dignity of honest work. 1 year later, Nancy stood on the deck of the Honest Endeavor as it sailed into Port Royal Harbor for their monthly supply run. The Nancy Martinez Fund for Worker Protection had already helped more than 50 people escape abusive situations or recover from workplace injuries. The fund's success had inspired similar programs in other Caribbean ports, creating a network of support for the most vulnerable members of maritime society. Their business partnership with the Reformed Merchant Guild had exceeded all expectations. The Honest Endeavor was now the flagship of a small but growing fleet of trading vessels, and they were planning to expand into the Pacific trade routes within the next 2 years. Nancy had proven herself to be a shrewd negotiator and capable administrator, earning respect throughout the Caribbean business community. More personally, Nancy was 3 months pregnant with their first child. The pregnancy had been a surprise, but a welcome one that filled both her and Christopher with joy and anticipation. Dr. James had assured them that her old injuries would not affect her ability to carry and deliver a healthy baby, and Nancy found herself looking forward to the challenges of motherhood. As they docked at Port Royal, Nancy was greeted by a delegation from the Merchant Guild, including Rogers and several other officials she had come to know and respect over the past year. The relationship was still somewhat formal, but it was built on genuine mutual respect rather than fear or obligation. "Mrs. Martinez," Rogers said with a smile, "welcome back to Port Royal. I trust your voyage was successful?" "Very much so," Nancy replied, returning his smile. "We have a full cargo of spices from the Windward Islands, and I believe we have found a new supplier for the textile goods you requested." As they discussed business matters, Nancy reflected on how much had changed since that terrible night in the alley. She had transformed not only her own life, but had helped to change the culture of an entire port city. The Nancy Martinez Fund had become a symbol of hope for working people throughout the Caribbean, proof that even the most powerless individuals could rise above their circumstances and create something meaningful. But perhaps the most important change was in herself. She no longer defined herself by what had been done to her, but by what she had chosen to do with her life afterward. The scars on her legs remained, but they no longer represented shame or victimhood. Instead, they were proof of her resilience, evidence that she could survive anything and emerge stronger on the other side. That evening, as she and Christopher dined at the governor's mansion as honored guests, Nancy found herself thinking about all the people who had played a role in her transformation. William Hall, who had given her a chance when she was just a frightened girl looking for work. Dr. James, who had healed not only her body, but had helped her understand that her worth was not determined by her physical limitations. The crew of the Honest Endeavor, who had accepted her as a partner and friend rather than just the captain's wife. And most of all, Christopher, who had seen something valuable in a broken tavern girl and had given her the time and space to discover her own strength. He had not rescued her in the traditional sense, had not swept her away to safety and demanded her gratitude in return. Instead, he had offered her choices and opportunities, had supported her growth without trying to control or limit it. "What are you thinking about?" Christopher asked, noticing her contemplative mood. "Just how far we have all come," Nancy replied, placing her hand over her still flat stomach. "A year ago, I was lying broken in an alley, convinced my life was over. Now I am sitting in the governor's mansion, pregnant with our child, discussing business deals worth thousands of pounds. It seems almost impossible." Christopher reached across the table to take her free hand. "Nothing about it is impossible. You had the strength and intelligence to build this life all along. You just needed the opportunity to show it." Nancy smiled at her husband, this complex man who had shown her that love could be both passionate and gentle, that strength could be used to protect rather than dominate. Their child would grow up in a world very different from the one she had known as a young woman, a world where people were judged by their character and contributions rather than their birth or circumstances. As they prepared to return to their ship, Nancy took one last look around the elegant dining room where they had been entertained as equals and friends. Tomorrow they would sail for Nassau, then on to Havana, and eventually back to Haven's Rest. It was a good life filled with purpose and love and the satisfaction of meaningful work. The tavern girl who had once served drinks to pirates and merchants was gone, replaced by a woman who commanded respect in boardrooms and harbors throughout the Caribbean. But Nancy would never forget where she had come from, would never lose sight of the fact that her success was built on the foundation of others' kindness and her own determination to rise above her circumstances. She had found her strength not in revenge or bitterness, but in the simple act of choosing to build rather than destroy, to heal rather than wound, to love rather than hate. It was a lesson she would carry with her for the rest of her life, and one she would pass on to the child growing within her. The broken legs that had once seemed like the end of everything had instead become the beginning of a new chapter, one filled with more hope and happiness than she had ever dared to imagine. Nancy Martinez had learned that true strength came not from avoiding hardship, but from transforming it into something beautiful and meaningful. And in that transformation, she had found not only her own redemption, but the power to help others find theirs as well.